Hello everyone, welcome in. Today I wanted to talk about upgrading Rails, which if you've never done or considered upgrading a Rails application, it can feel overwhelming to consider the process and figure out all the steps required. So today we'll give you a short overview into the 3 most common approaches to upgrading, and then a deeper dive into dual booting and how every app can take advantage of it. If you've ever felt that sense of dread, knowing that a new version of Rails was about to be released and that your version was quickly headed towards that end of life and not receiving those critical security updates, well, I've been there. So today you're going to be able to apply today's talk to mostly any version, but we won't be talking about the specifics that you need to do between versions. Only the process. I've done 7 Rails upgrades, and this is what I wish I knew when I started. So as a heads up, my slides move really fast, so if you're trying to take notes, don't worry, the slides will be available today at the end of the talk, and the link will be at the end of the talk again. So who am I? This, of course, causes existential dread every time I get asked this question, but I do have an answer, and that's, my name's Andrea Fomera, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior product developer at Podia, and I've also created a few courses, one of which happens to be building a real-time form with Hotwire, which you can get for free on my website. If you're curious, you can find out more about me at afomera.dev. If you're curious to learn more about Podia, Podia is an all-in-one platform you can use to sell courses, webinars, download, and community. You can find out more about Podia at podia.com, and thanks to them for making it possible to come today. So it's actually my first time in Portland. I'm super excited, so thank you all for coming to my talk. I'm also incredibly nervous, so bear with me. It was also my first time on a rail, so that was cool, going to RailsConf. I had to make that. I'm going to start off today, and I want to start with a story. But this is a scary story, so I have to warn you of the first time I upgraded Rails professionally. So imagine, if you will, working on a Rails 4.2 application, and you're 6 months into the process to upgrade to Rails 5.0. And you finally get all of those tests passing. Woohoo! Hooray, right? You've made it. You're at the finish line. Let's look at that date on that. It might be hard to see, but that is posted on June 22nd, 2017. This was 6 months into the Rails 5 upgrade process. 6 months upgrading any spare moment I had between projects, morning, afternoon, evening. Finally had things passing. Hooray! Super excited for the possibilities. Action cable, here I come, right? Except somebody merged in more code. Brand new feature, 3,000 lines changed, 60 files, brand new test added, and then I had to merge in their changes. It was a sad day. I cried a little bit. I also maybe yelled, but it's okay. It was really a crushing moment for me on this project. I had to repeat so much of the work that I had spent the last year or 6 months working on. Was there a better way to do this, I wondered? I didn't know of any other way. I was just merging in changes in a branch, trying to get it passing. There was a better way. We're going to talk about that today. So you may be wondering, when did I actually finish that upgrade? January 2018. I found this when I was looking through my tweets, and I was like, I really want to give this conference talk, so I'm really thankful to be able to give it today. So you might be a bit like this, and then maybe if you've never upgraded, you turn into this. And I'm like, no way, I can't take that on. My company, it's too much work for me, my company, my team. But really, I believe that everyone can upgrade, and there is a better way. But I can't lie, it can just be a lot of work. So you have to take it a step at a time, and don't try and jump from Rails 5.2 if you're on, or don't try and jump straight to like Rails 5.2 if you're on Rails 4.2. You have to go a step at a time. So things did get a bit faster once I got to Rails 5.0. We had 5.1 upgraded in April of 2018. And then 5.2 sometime in May of 2018. I wouldn't attempt the Rails 6 upgrade at that job. I decided it was easier to just leave. So you may be wondering, like, why? Why should I upgrade if it's a lot of work? Why do I want to stay up to date? And really, the first thing is possible improvements to performance from upstream. GitHub, Shopify, and so many others are constantly making tweaks to the Rails codebase for performance, or, as Aline talked in the keynote today, fixing bugs. You don't want those 10-year-old bugs. You get to stay up to date, and that's more attractive to developers. I don't know a single Rails developer who wants to work on a Rails 3 application. If there is somebody out here who is, I'm so sorry for you. It's easier for these same developers to find helpful and up-to-date documentation. Again, I can't find any information on Rails 3. I don't know if it's out there. But staying up to date is way helpful for that. You get to take advantage of the security updates, bug fixes, and changes that benefit you from upstream as well. An example that came to mind is we used to have to require a new gem, like a gem for check constraints with Postgres in our application at work. And when we upgraded to Rails 6.1, we didn't need that gem anymore. You get to take advantage of the new features in the framework without as much overhead. These are things like action cable, active storage, hotwire, action text, multiple database support baked in. It used to be really hard to do multiple databases in Rails. So let's talk about the things you need to consider when you're thinking about doing an upgrade. Do you have good team buy-in? This is things like buy-in from your team or upper management. If you don't have good buy-in, it's going to be harder to get support to take time and keep your apps updated. Sometimes management doesn't view upgrading as a feature, and that can be really hard to combat. Try to use the whys to convince them it'll be good for the business in the long run for the speed of creating new features down the road. Secondly, you're going to want a good test suite. If you have low or no test coverage, that's going to make the upgrade harder because it means more risk. And when you upgrade, we want to reduce as much risk as possible during upgrades. So you'll have to supplement the low test coverage with more test coverage or more manual testing, and that can increase the workload during the upgrade. Lastly, you're going to need some willpower and persistence to get through some really weird errors. If you were sitting next to me, the actual words you would have heard me say was, "What does it mean?" And "Wait, why did that happen?" And "What the?" Okay, those are just the PG-censored words, but you get the point. But there's certainly a few more things to consider. Like, is your Ruby up to date or compatible? An example here is Rails 7 requires Ruby 2.7. Here's an example of the version, the release date, and the compatible Ruby version since Rails 3.2. This was actually found on Wikipedia, so that was super helpful. But what you want to do is you want to avoid being in the red versions. If you're in that version, you should be working your way out. Also, a note, Rails 5.2 is headed that way in the red, so upgrade. Do you have a lot of gems that are out of date or other dependencies? Are you extending core Rails functionality? Do you have things like data migration gems, active record patches that you're trying to get more Postgres functionality? Or are you monkey patching? It can be really overwhelming to think about these things for the first time, and you may not know. This is why it's super helpful if you have a teammate who knows more about your app than you to help you. If you have a lot of gems that are out of date, this was me at my first job. That was actually the bulk of the upgrade. These are the blockers to getting your app bundling and booting in a new Rails version. I don't know if you've ever seen the error when you bundle and there's a version incompatibility and you're like, what is happening here? I don't know which gem it is. These are part of the things if you work with DevFu or something else like DependentBot for dependency management, you can get those upgrades in there for those gems ahead of time. So I recommend using something like DevFu for dependency management. Basically, the concept is they take care of sending you a pull request. You wake up, you have a pull request that looks something like this. In this case, that's a Puma, update. There's also a security vulnerability in that Puma version, and it gave me all the information right up front, so I was able to merge it in. You're also able to use dev.foo or dependentbot for JavaScript updates, which we know it's like a JavaScript thing here, so like, yeah. You gotta update those too. I highly recommend using something like dev.foo or dependentbot for this process. Okay, enough said about all of that. Let's talk about the 3 ways to upgrade your app. The first is gonna be paying somebody else to do it. It sounds really silly to consider, but if your company doesn't want to take the time for you to spend on it and they have the money, they can pay somebody else. But you're going to need a good test suite. The last number I heard from somebody who does professional Rails upgrades, it's like 70 to 80% to take you on as a client. The long-running branch strategy. So the basics here is you make a new branch, Rails 7, you make all the changes you need to make, change the configuration, all of that fun stuff, get all of the tests passing, and then you deploy it. But until then, you have to keep merging in changes. That scary story, I used this strategy, and it took me over a year. The commit tree on the GitHub was over 400 commits by the time I merged it in, and GitHub wouldn't even show me all the commits. And then the third way is dual booting. And this is more commonly talked about for a big company like GitHub or Shopify are going to be updating Rails. And it's my preferred approach now, and we'll get into why. But the basics are here. You set it up so you can run both versions of Rails or your dependencies at the same time, and you can switch between them. So any strategy, regardless of which one you pick, is going to follow the same approach. If you pay somebody else, they'll just follow this approach and not tell you, probably. They're going to follow an upgrading checklist. And this is something that I have built over the years. And each time you upgrade, you can add things that you're going to remember to your upgrade. We'll start with the basics of mine, and then you can modify it as you need. So the first thing you start with is those deprecation messages. How many of you are ignoring deprecation messages? Yeah, I see a few hands, yeah. Me too. You're gonna go through and fix those deprecation messages. The Rails team usually tries to do a good job of deprecating things in advance before they change things out from underneath you. So fix them in advance when you see them, and you'll thank yourself later. Then you update the gem file to upgrade Rails to the version you're updating to. Again, this is also where you run into that problem with your dependencies out of date. You might have to change a few things. If you're upgrading early in the process, you might have to fix a few gems, and that's a great opportunity to contribute to open source to make it compatible with, say, Rails 7.1. Now, a note here is to only change the minimum required when you're upgrading Rails. Try to keep the feature changes or non-Rails upgrade-related bug fixes out of these pull requests. I know it's super tempting. You're in the file, just, I want to fix that typo. Don't do it. Don't do it. You can do that later. Stay focused on the Rails upgrade. Then you go through the Rails upgrade guide. The Rails team usually does a good job of notating what changes, and if not, that's a great spot for you to contribute back into open source. Run the Rails app update command, or you can generate a fresh new Rails app and compare the environment and initialize folders. I oftentimes will do the fresh app strategy with the version I'm upgrading to and look at the configuration changes and see what's changed. Then, before every upgrade, I have to test my rollout and rollback plan. Sometimes Rails changes how sessions or cookies are stored, and this can cause side effects if you need to roll back. Things I generally test include sessions, encrypted cookies, signed IDs, global IDs, check if they work between versions. I've been bit by that before. We should talk about risk. Every upgrade has its risk to upgrading. And when you choose to upgrade, it's a balance between risk and reward. It can either go off the rails or really well. So if something was going off the rails, you would have things 500ing, your app couldn't load, and nobody could do anything on it. But going really well, nobody's going to notice. that's kind of the downside here. If you do everything properly, nobody knows it happens. But if you do it wrong, they're gonna know. So the trick is gonna be to find a balance that works for you and your team and your projects. One way that might work for you is to dual boot. And so you're like, okay, so like, how do you actually dual boot? And there's a few gems you can look at, like Next Rails, or Boot Boot is my favorite now. So I use Boot Boot, which is a gem created by Shopify, and it's a bundler plugin to help you manage multiple gem files for different versions of your dependencies. Here's the GitHub repository, and if any Shopify folks are in here, thanks for working on it. So let's talk installing Boot Boot into your application. The first step is to add the bundler plugin to your gem file. You do this by specifying plugin Boot Boot and an optional version. Kind of strange not to put gem in front when you're in the gem file, but you get used to it. Then bundle install and bundle Boot Boot, and that'll create a new gem file next lock for you. What does that look like? Oh, hey, there it is in my file tree. At first, that file is going to look exactly the same as your gem file lock file, but now we've got two separate files that Bundler will know which one to use when you're on your next version. What else did that change, though? In the gem file, it added this handy-dandy code here to load the Boot Boot plugin, and then enable dual booting if the environment variable dependencies next was present. Okay, so let's plug in our new versions. Hey, all right, we're gonna try and go for GitHub on main. We've got Rails 6.1 running by default in the else branch, and then we're running against main from GitHub when dependencies next is present. When you use Boot Boot, you should prefix commands with dependencies underscore next. So example, dependencies next equals 1, bundle install, or to start the Rails server, dependencies next equals 1, Rails server. You can run this locally. You can use this locally to run your Rails server in Rails 7 instead of Rails 6.1 like your coworkers. Dependencies is really long. I don't got time for that. What if you wanted to change it? Well, we can change this. So to change it, you can just, by set the Boot Boot environment prefix to Rails, we can now update our code to use if environment Rails next for our update. Much cleaner and shorter. This is the approach we use at Podia for our upgrades, and it's so easy for our developers to remember and type, even if we're using it to upgrade Ruby. Did you catch that? We can use this to upgrade Ruby versions as well. Since it's a bundler plugin and not specific to Rails, you can treat the Ruby declaration inside of the if statements, and you're good to go. And I've also swapped back to dependencies next here because I've changed my mind. Since we're not using upgrading Rails. This is also able to be ran in production or staging. You just need to set the environment variable there as well during your pipeline. If you're on Heroku, it's a little harder to explain, but like, so is a lot of things on Heroku right now. One thing I recommend doing is setting up a separate CI build as soon as you start this process. And I like to test the next version of Rails periodically. In most circumstances in your CI build, you need to just change the CI environment to set the dependencies next environment variable, or whatever you renamed it to, for most of the commands, bundling install, setting up your database, and the spec commands. At Podia, we use a separate GitHub action workflow to run our test suite against the next version of Rails when we push to a branch with the Rails-next prefix. This prevents us from needing to spend money testing against it if we're not actively updating. There's a decent amount of stuff I'm going to gloss over for the sake of time, but the approach I generally take with Boot Boot is to use any code that can't be ran in both versions and an if statement, looking at if the environment variable is present or not. Any code that works in the current version goes in the else part, and then any code that works in either version doesn't need an if statement. Don't put one there. Once I'm sure the upgrade path is safe, I'll remove the old code in the else statement and then put the new code everywhere. This prepares us for the upgrade for the next time. Okay, so every approach you pick is going to have perks and downsides. What are dual booting's perks? You get smaller, easier to review pull requests for your coworkers. You can use that opportunity to explain why and how each change is necessary. And you get it into the code base without needing to keep rebasing and merging in changes. It's so nice. You can have a rollout, rollback strategy. It's so much easier with the boot to roll out and roll back if you make a mistake or find an error. The common test that I use here is to log into the app using the old version of Rails. I'll stop and reboot the app into the new version of Rails, and I'll click around and see if everything works. Then I'll stop the server and reboot the app into the old version again. Is the user still logged in? Is everything still okay? Just to recap, I also like to test the sessions or signed IDs, and those kind of things work the way between versions. And rolling back. Because I've rolled out and then rolled back and everybody's been logged out, and that's really uncomfortable. Dual booting reduces the risk of falling behind or abandoning upgrades attempts. That first story where it took me a year to do the long-running branch strategy, if I wasn't really persistent in wanting an action cable, I would have given up a long time ago. So I'd have to go behind and merge everything in again. And I repeated the same file 15 times. So it also reduces disruption on other developers. They might not want to do a code freeze. I've been at places where when you upgrade, you have to code freeze for a week or two. By dual booting, you reduce the disruption that other developers may feel. One day they're on Rails 6.1, you flip the switch, and now they can be on Rails 6.7. Okay, so we've seen the pros. What kind of cons or downsides might there be to dual booting? You have to clean up those if statements. And that could be next to nothing, or it could be a lot, depending on the size of your application. I always try and see if the code that I can write for the next version of Rails works in the current version of Rails, and then I don't need to ship that in that same pull request. That can just be independently updated. Additionally, one recommendation I have for you is to look into automated tooling to remove the if statement. An example here is a Rubocop linter can probably clean up if statements like this. You have to prefix your commands with dependencies next or whatever environment variable you've set it to. On Heroku, that's challenging, but it can be done. It might be excessive to dual boots. If your app is small or the long-running branch strategy works for you, or if your team is small, if there's only one or two of you, it might feel a bit like overkill. So those are just a few of the cons that I came up with for this approach. You might have more, you might have less. Every team, company, or app is different, and that's one of the great things about programming. Okay, let's bring this train into the station and talk about some bits that you may have been wondering. How do I bring this up to my manager? You can use the whys you may want to upgrade to talk about how it can be done safely and limit risk. Managers are really scared of risk. And you can talk about the benefits to the company with the new features, the speed and performance, and all of that. Upgrade your non-Rails gem dependencies outside of the process using something like Depfoo or Dependabots. Take it slow, read the docs, and limit the risk as much as possible during the upgrade. Have those rollback plans in place and test those scenarios. You can do it. You've got it. If it's the first time you've upgraded Rails, it's a little scary, but it does get easier every time you upgrade as you learn. And it's so worth it. Okay, so if you're curious and want to chat with me about more stuff, I always love to talk about upgrading Rails and dependencies, as well as Vue components. We're heavy users of it. I would love to meet you. You can find the slides here. I'll leave this up for a minute. It should be up in 6 minutes. And then, thank you so much for listening, and there's where you can find me online. I very appreciate it. Thank you.